In this segment, we will be preparing our mesh for baking. The first thing I want to do is select my mesh and start detaching elements that I want to be baking from. So the theory behind this is that we want to make sure that each mesh has enough space to bake outwards. We do not want things to be intersecting with each other if they all sit within one element. In this case, I'm going to be really safe and detach most of my elements to be pretty far apart. However, the pieces in the middle have enough space to just bake off their own. We must also make sure that our high poly mesh is detached exactly the same way as our low poly mesh. As you can see here, I have two pieces of geometry in the high poly that are separate. What I need to do now is attach one of them to the other, so it could be one full mesh, just like the low poly is. Now that everything has been detached appropriately, I should now start assigning materials. If you're not familiar with how Substance Designer and Substance Painter works with their baking workflow, how it works is that you assign material colors to your high poly mesh, and that can be used as a color ID map. This will be much easier to separate my mesh in the texturing phase later on. As you can see, I'm assigning really random colors to each individual piece, so that way it's a lot easier to pick out when I start doing an ID color map. Due to the density of this high poly mesh, it will take a while to select things and assign materials. And because of that, I'm going to stop the video and skip ahead. What I will be doing is assigning materials to different parts of the model, so that way it's easier for me to pick it out during the texturing phase. So now a high poly mesh has been assigned material IDs. This can be useful in the texturing phase because it will generate a color ID map, which will be really good for when we want to add different materials to different parts of the low poly mesh. So the first thing to take note is that everything in this high poly mesh has been detached and grouped in the exact same way as the low poly mesh. So despite the fact that everything has different material IDs, it's still one mesh. So the first thing we're going to do is unhide the low poly and just make sure that things are matching up. The low poly matches the high poly in terms of elements. So it'll be something easy for us to bake later on. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to rename these meshes. This is a really useful thing I use. So you go to Tools and Rename Objects. And what this feature does is it will rename everything to whatever base name you decide to give it. So in this case, I'm giving it Victory 3D _ crate 01. And then if I click rename, this will rename all of the meshes to be what I've just typed in, as you can see here. So despite the fact that they're all different elements and different meshes, they all have the same name. So how this could be useful is that we can now start to deselect the high poly and the low poly meshes and change the name to whatever we want next, which is 02. And now everything is named Victory 3D _ crate _ 02. And we just continue with this process. And the reason this is necessary is because later on, when we bring this into Substance Painter, you will need to basically split your meshes apart based on the naming convention you've given your meshes. And this makes things very easy for baking, and it's just a much faster approach to doing things compared to how we used to do baking with like X normals and such. So just checking through, you can see that everything has the assigned names, and now you can see in my layer list that it's exactly the way I want it to be. So what you want to do is select the low poly, uncheck base name, and check suffix. And what suffix will do is it will add whatever you type in to the end of the mesh name. So we're going to name our low poly _LP, and we're also going to do the exact same thing for the high poly by adding _HP for high poly. And this is just all we really need to do. It's actually that simple. So once this is all ready and you've named it properly, you can now export this. And now with the low poly now exported, we can now export the high poly, which will take significantly longer in comparison since it's so dense. And now this is done, we can move into Substance Painter to start baking. So here we are in Substance Painter, and the first thing we want to do is go to New File. And we want to find our low poly mesh, which is this one here, Victory3D_create. And we want to make sure the document resolution is 4K instead of 2K, because we want high res, and make sure it's DirectX, and you click OK. Now here we have our low poly, and what we need to do is now, assign some like texturing channels and also bake our high poly. So in the texture set settings window, if you go to the top where it says channels, there's a little plus sign. You click that and you click ambient occlusion, and we also want to add an emissive channel. Right there, yeah. Now let's go to bake mesh maps, and let's set our settings. We want the output document size to match our output size, which is 4K. Dilation width is no biggie. You can just add any number you want. I'm going to choose 16, and then we're going to add our high poly mesh. Now we're not going to use a cage. We're going to use the frontal distance features that comes in Substance Painter, and we're going to set that to 0.03 for both of them. That usually works out for me most of the time. And we want to make sure the match is set to mesh name as well, so it's reading our mesh names for baking. Anti-aliasing, we want to set that to 4x4, and we want to also put in the suffix abbreviations we did for our mesh naming, so it can tell the difference between what to bake on what mesh. These three channels, ID, ambient occlusion, and thickness, we want to turn them off as we don't want them to be baked with 4x4 sampling, otherwise it causes issues when we get to a masking stage. And with that set, we just hit bake. And there we go. This is our low poly. This is like the normal map now, and it looks good. It looks like it's turned out the way I want it to turn out. Yeah, it's pretty solid. So now we want to make sure we now bake the ID map and everything as well. But just before, I want to just make sure it looks okay with the lighting, and just make sure there's no nasty kind of artifacts or anything like that. Bottom seems okay. It seems fine. So yeah. So let's go bake the color ID map and the ambient occlusion. So you want to basically flip the channels here. We still don't want thickness because thickness isn't something we need to use. But first, let's turn off anti-aliasing, and let's select our ID and ambient occlusion map and turn off everything else. Now if you go into ID, we want to change it to material color because we want to read the material color of the high poly mesh. And to be honest, color generator, I'd usually just set to random. It's not a big deal. It's just as long as you have something to color pick from later on. So we click bake, and that's pretty much all we really need to do with baking the maps in here. It's really fast, it's really simple once you've got everything set up. At this point, basically, we are ready to start texturing. So in the next video segment, we're going to get into texturing and hopefully bring this low poly mesh to life.